Joe Biden's address in Philadelphia yesterday, where he compared the state of our current union with the state of our union back during the Civil War, and he did it a lot of different times. Here was one of those cuts, play number 2.
So on free and fair elections is just such a threat, literally. I've said it before. We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. That's not hyperbole. Since the Civil War. The Confederates, back then, never breached the Capitol, as insurrectionists did on January the 6th. I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying this because you should be alarmed.
This is just such a flagrantly, absurdly ridiculous comparison, Buck, and I think we need to explain exactly what's going on here. But this is not in any way similar. They have moved from saying, Buck, that 9/11 was not as bad as January 6th. Now, Joe Biden has said that the Civil War, he is comparing the Civil War and the Confederate Army to the riot that we saw on January 6th, as if they are in any way part and parcel of the same thing. This is so laughably absurd, and yet he's even saying in his speech this isn't hyperbole. I know Joe Biden has said a lot of ridiculous things in his career, but this is up there among the most ridiculous that he has ever uttered on a public stage as a president.
Democrats have embraced crisis governance, and that even means the creation of crisis for their governance. They'll stir up a narrative. They'll conjure up a way of talking about these things so that everyone is supposed to be terrified. I mean, notice at the end he says, I'm not saying this to scare you, basically, but you should be scared. I mean, that's one of the most classic Biden moments you've ever seen, right? This guy is a true demagogue. So usually a demagogue is a person who says things that he knows to be untrue to a bunch of people that he thinks to be not very smart. I think that's Mencken or someone said that. Biden's a guy who's not very smart, who also says things that he thinks to be untrue to people that he knows wants to hear things that are untrue. And that's where we are with the Democrats now. What really is the point of invoking January 6th and Confederates during the Civil War? Is the suggestion, I mean, it's quite clear what the suggestion is actually, that somehow a bunch of unarmed protesters, and the fact that the media still refers to it as a deadly riot. Yeah, deadly for one of the rioters. And we still can't know the name of the officer who shot her. It wasn't deadly because of the rioters attacking people and killing them. And yet he's comparing it to that. He's comparing it to the Confederates in the Civil War. You have to wonder, is anything too much for them? I mean, Joe Biden is a reckless buffoon who a year ago was pretending he wanted to unite the country. No one could really say that that's been the mission here. In fact, dividing the country by using the most overheated and absurd rhetoric possible is what's going on here. I mean, look at the voting provisions they're talking about in Texas, Clay. We've been discussing them. We're going to have the governor of Texas on today, Abbott, to just get into that whole situation with us in some detail. Voter ID is Jim Crow 2.0. I mean, they're really going to compare segregation of water fountains and public accommodations and literacy tests explicitly designed to prevent black Americans from voting during that period of our nation's history from everybody having to show voter ID? I mean, what won't Joe Biden say at this point? The media is such a bunch of throne-shining bootlickers. It's so depressing and depraved to see them doing this. And just Joe Biden is a mediocrity who's been elevated so that the handlers around him can have left-wing governance through Grandpa Biden. It's madness. I mean, what he said yesterday, it was honestly, Clay, the worst speech Joe Biden's ever given, and that's saying a lot.
And what is transparently ridiculous about it is all of the falsehoods. Because, again, this idea, and I wish, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who could go back in time and splice the coverage between an entire summer of riots where lots of people were injured and lots of death occurred that was defended to the high heavens. What riots are the voice of the voiceless, right? That's what we heard from the Don Lemons and the Jake Tappers and the Rachel Maddows all summer long as the cities across America were burning. And now there's this obsession with January 6th and labeling it and trying to tie it in with the overarching theme of the Democratic Party, Buck, which is pretty straightforward. Everything is racist. Joe Biden has bought in. You'd asked, why is he trying to tie it to the Confederacy? I think he's trying to tie it to the Civil War because he's trying to equate people who protested on January 6th with slaveholding Confederates back in the 1860s. And one of the great flaws that has been allowed to flourish over the past several years is this attack upon American history and a fundamental lack of understanding of all of our history. But to argue after here's what offends me from a pure logic perspective, Buck, and I want to get your reaction to this. We spent 4 years, the Democrats did, and in this country debating whether Donald Trump was a legitimately elected president or not, and whether Russia had colluded to put him into office, whether he was a Manchurian candidate. Patron saint of the Democratic Party, Stacey Abrams, never conceded her loss of the Georgia election in the gubernatorial race against Brian Kemp by 50,000 votes and became a hero. How can you argue that our democracy is under siege now when you spent 4 years twice impeaching the democratically elected president of the United States, questioning his legitimacy, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on investigations, and now you're going to argue that our democracy is sacrosanct because you have ended up in office and any questioning of how you ended up in office is unfair? That is transparently false.
They're also doing this because it's a preemptive strike against the next election. One thing that always haunts Democrats is that they're not very good at governance. Demagoguery, playing to the mob, pandering, these are things Democrats excel at. But governance, actual results of policies that people could see and feel and that matter, not so good as we see in the Biden administration. They're already concerned about their grip on power. They know that anybody who's paying attention can see that good old Grandpa Joe is an absurdity and always has been. They used to know that, too, which is what's so remarkable. But now they pretend that that wasn't the case in previous elections where he was effectively laughed off the stage. And now here we are being told that this is the greatest assault on our democracy. And since the Civil War, Clay, and explicitly comparing it to Jim Crow. And remember, Joe Biden's the guy who said, quote, put y'all back in chains, end quote. I mean, he's already played with racial politics in ways that are reckless and deeply irresponsible. But they're setting it up so that if they lose the next election, I can assure you, and I mean the midterms and the presidential election after that, Democrats right now already believe that it's because Republicans suppressed minority votes. It's built in from the beginning. And then that means that the mentality becomes anything to do the hashtag resistance of the 4 years under Trump, to bring the gears of government to a halt, to shut down important parts of federal bureaucracies, to use the courts to block federal policy in bad faith. It's all justified, Clay, because it can never be justified. It can never be acceptable for this Republican Party that's trying to institute Jim Crow 2.0 to win another election.
Well, and ultimately, to me, what it represents, Buck, is a recognition of how they had the fix in 2020 and they won the election by 40,000 votes. They had big tech in their corner. They changed all the rules about how people could vote because of COVID. Again, and I think this is significant, and I think it spells doom for the Democratic Party in 2022 and 2024, and I think some of the rational Democrats know this. If not for COVID, Donald Trump wins in 2020 by, I think, what would have been an electoral landslide, right? I think he would have flipped Minnesota. I think he would have won Nevada. I think he would have won New Mexico. If not for COVID, all of their Donald Trump, orange man bad arguments disappear. COVID became the approximation, the metaphor of Donald Trump's awfulness, and they leaned into it, as much as they possibly could. And they're still leaning into it, right? We're going to talk about that some with all the ridiculous comments that are still being made about the vaccination-related issues. But I think they know that a whirlwind is coming for them in 2022 and 2024, and they are desperate, Buck, to change the laws while they can to try to forestall that whirlwind, because identity politics and cancel culture is going to go up in smokes.
To your point, Orange Man bad, worse than Hitler, the stuff that they used to say, fascism in America. The best they could do with the Trump administration in office during a once-in-a-century pandemic was to squeak out a victory
40,000 votes
for the presidency and have a 50-50 tie in the Senate and actually lose seats because they came into it with a majority in the House. I wouldn't feel particularly good about the near-term future of progressivism in America, a term you don't hear enough these days anymore. But that's why they're going for broke. And I think that's what this really is, their push to try to break through on the filibuster. Remember, it's crazy until they do it.